You can see my screen. Thank you so very much for this opportunity, and for all the people that are not spending their Saturday afternoon out. We've got glorious sunshine here in Perth. It actually does look like the picture behind me, and are here to think about STEM and STEM education. And it's an area that, as Yuli and Ella had kindly said, that Rika and I have been working in for a number of years. So I thought I would talk about a couple of things, a little bit about what it looks like, why it's important, and how we can teach it. And also in this space at the moment, the notion of digital STEM and what does that look like, and can we do this in a digital space? So I'm really looking forward to your questions. I geared it a little bit towards teachers and education students. So I'm not sure who else engaged in this space, but we're interested to hear your thoughts about this. But this is years and years of our research in this area. And all the photos along the way are related to the work that we did with the STEMinists. So this is a very early photo of us with STEMinists in Australia. I thought I'd start with the elephant in the room with regards to COVID-19 and the COVID response, because although this has been an incredibly difficult time, in terms of STEM and education, I think personally, it has been an amazing highlight to see the communities of researchers coming together. So we have had, not just in Australia, not just in the US, but across the world, we have had this enormous coming together of researchers. So we've had the scientists coming together, looking at the virus itself and how they are managing that. We've had researchers from the US send virus particles to the Australians Hadron Collider so that can then, they can look at particle acceleration and work out information about the molecular structure of the virus. We've had other samples coming in from different places to be tested in populations in Australia. So there's this collection and collaboration of the scientists. And then, of course, I've put in for the maths down the bottom. We've had an inordinate amount of modelling around flattening the curve. Now, for someone that's not in this space, you imagine in January having a conversation with neighbours and friends about notion of flattening the curve. We're having conversations that are incorporating an awful lot of information, both in maths and in science, in technology and in engineering. So I pulled in the science from around the virus. I pulled in the maths modelling and the importance of bringing maths into that space. The technology, this was, or up in your left-hand corner, shows the 4.5 million people infected with COVID, and that is a fabulous example of from Johns Hopkins University in the US, that's showing live how the virus is spreading and how the recovery rates are going, and that's all due to the technology, and that's been running since I first found it in early February. So that's been running a long time. It's really, really useful. And all these things are open source. There is an incredible generosity of sharing of information and ideas. The final one I put up was, of course, engineering, looking at engineering face masks and all that information around 3D printing that, again, is being shared. So while it's been a very difficult time, there's been a lot of rhetoric in politics, the scientists and the STEMinists, if you like, the science, the maths, the technology, the technologists, the engineers have come together in an unprecedented way. So I suppose almost I could stop there and say STEM is happening in our world. There is a free sharing of ideas. There is a cooperation and a communication that has been incredibly amazing to see. And it's one of the highlights because they've put commercialism behind them and are looking at saving lives And I don't think this is there comes a clearer idea of why we need STEM and why STEM education is just so important. So I don't think I will stop there, but I think that was a really important conversation to have from this at the beginning of this. Oops, sorry. So there's a lot of conversations. I'm going to bring in to hear the literature. I don't think you can have conversations about why and wherefore without looking at what's been going on. So this is from UNESCO. And it's talking about STEM. So STEM is becoming more and more as an important term. It's highlighting the need and the value that they see that STEM will bring into the careers of tomorrow. And that was 2017, so it's relatively recent. Again, we're talking about the fact that we're running out of, or the US will run out of people with the sorts of degrees in that STEM space. So what we're saying to you is that, or the literature is saying that STEM is incredibly important. Just a little bit about the history. I really just put a little bit together, and this is from a really good paper from one of my colleagues, Sue Blackley, with Jennifer, and they looked at where STEM, how it appeared on the scene and where it tracked through into the systems. So in the 1990s, SMET, wasn't as catchy, didn't catch at all. SMET, and that was through the National Science Foundation, eventually decided STEM was a lot catchier. It's sad when we have to have catchy words in order to adopt them. And then it was coming through in the European Commission around the same time, reaching Australia in the early 2000s. In 2006, the UK finally adopted the term STEM. It had been looking at science and technology before then, and calling it SET. And then it was picked up by some big organizations. So the OECD, the World Bank, the United Nations, the EU, and all of them starting to, and as far as we can see, even right down in 2015 and beyond in predictiveness, there is a notion that this is not going to ebb, that the need for STEM has been recognized. And so the next thing is, how do we do that? How do we do that in a classroom in a way that is easy for teachers to manage? Otherwise, we set them up and make it really very difficult. So these photos, as I said, are all from our STEMinists. This is our pipeline activity. Yes, Ella's very familiar with this. So it's about conceptualization of STEM and how difficult it has been. And some organizations, for example, departments of education, have been very pedantic about STEM. They have said that it has to have equal quantities of science, technology, engineering, and maths. So I think the first thing that's hampered STEM is how people are defining it. So in its widest form, and that happens across the hallways out of education with my colleagues, they talk about S.T.E.M. So that is a community that incorporates scientists, technologists, mathematicians, and engineers. So anyone that falls under that purview, that group is included in that. Then, for example, Curtin has an extra M. It adds medicine into that and embraces that as its philosophy. And then we get the notion of all the other words that are added into this and becomes with the arts, the STEAM, and so forth. So what I did do was I wanted to pull up some of the latest thinking around what was out there in terms of how our goals for STEM. I found this relatively recently in the last couple of weeks, and it talks about the goals and outcomes and the scope and sequence. So it's starting to think a little bit more deeply about what STEM might look like. And this is one of the most detailed and it's out of the US. It was out of a report from the National Academy of Science. So as part of that, and it was called Integrated STEM Education, probably more K to 12 particularly, but it's talking about STEM literacy, 21st century competencies, the readiness of creating that STEM workforce, in interest in engagements and making connections, and even has goals, particularly for educators. So it is actually quite an interesting framework, and one of the few that exists. And as I said, I only picked it up out of the National Academy of Science in a 2020 paper. So when we went back and when we first started, and here's one of our beautiful drawings of a Wigglebot, we looked at the deliberate full or partial integration. Because what we found was happening was education systems, as I said. For example, our Department of Education insists that STEM has science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in any of the material that's written, which is fine, but it becomes more and more difficult and more artificial to contrive something that, and then say, well, we can't actually use this because we don't have an engineer. Well, sometimes you need an engineer in a project and sometimes you don't. And I think forcing it into equal boxes is actually quite unhelpful. So we've been using this definition, but one of my colleagues, Nicoletta Maynard, who's an engineer, was talking about what technology looked like and what engineering looked like for her. So I thought that she shares this with young students and gets them thinking about technology in a way that is very open. So she's talking not just about spaceships and fast trains. She's also including the technology of a woomera, which is a very old, ancient Aboriginal hunting tool. So she sees that this is, and even shoes, she sees has a deeper sense of technology embedded in them. And I like this because as an engineer, as we teach, we don't teach engineering, but we need to think about engineering. She sees the engineer as the problem solver. So the scientist, for example, will make the drug in the tablet at the bottom there, but it will be the engineer that decides or that works out how to make the tablet easy to swallow. So I thought that was a really interesting way for someone that is an engineer to consider how they form part of that STEM conversation. So she talked about the science and the maths, bringing that science and maths methodology, and then creating, and remember, this is from an engineer, so she has engineering very, very significantly placed in this, which is fine, but I liked it because she'd really thought deeply about how it all connected up together. So the engineering about the designing and creating solutions, and then how then the technology kicks in, and it all sits around what the earth, what society actually needs, and the notion of good for the environment and so forth. So I've started to think about that as quite an interesting way to think about connecting into that space. And I'm going to offer you other ways of looking at STEM. And I challenge you to leave with what you feel is what resonates with you. Because when you are, as teachers and educators, if that's what you are, that's what you are, then you need to find ways that make sense for you as you teach in this space. And so I think that's quite important. We talked about skills, and that is one of the things that Rika and I have spent a lot of time on, is thinking about not just content knowledge around STEM, but about those the skills that are embedded into that area as well. So if you're looking at lots of conversations with industry, they are often looking for graduates with these skills. And they've been calling them all sorts of things, and I think I've got some tables coming up, and I will talk a little bit more about them when I get to those tables. But we're talking about, and we call them 21st century skills. We call them, or people call them, STEM skills, which is real ignorance because they're so much broader than that. They're called soft skills, and I really dislike that, because if we're talking about them as being critical for jobs, then I think we demean them by calling them soft skills. And we also call them transversal competencies. So if we look further here, we can see the transversal competencies. Now, I use these because they are international way of thinking. But every single different group through European Union, the US, have all come up with a set of skills. And the only way that we could manage them, and I'm going to show you this one, is when we looked at how we could put them all together. So the UNESCO coined the terms transversal competencies. In Australia, we have similar capabilities and competencies into our framework, education framework as well. But I'll stick with the transversal competencies because I think they actually have a much wider awareness of, they're much wider use for people to talk about. So they come in 4 categories: critical and innovative thinking. So again, creativity, so critical and creative thinking, sometimes it's called, resourcefulness, reflective thinking, decision-making, and in the Australian curriculum, it has a similar term. We're talking about interpersonal skills, so those are the things that are outward-looking, so about teamwork, collaboration, the ability to show compassion, to be social, presentation skills, and ideas like that. And that 1312 number there is the number of times it's actually that presentation skill as a word is mentioned in the Australian curriculum. And then we look at the deeper personal skills around self-awareness and flexibility and compassion and self-motivation. So, and as you can see, there's already words that are coming up into both types. And then we look at global citizenship. That's a little bit easier because it is quite different. But the interpersonal and the intrapersonal skills, they are very difficult because I absolutely bet if we talk about demonstrating initiative, everybody that we talk to in this entire group of people will have a slightly different variation of that. And that becomes really tricky. So what does resilience look like? And is resilience the same for everybody? What we've done in the Australian general capability, which I think has been really useful, is we've taken the big idea and we've broken it down into smaller elements and then sub-elements. And I think that is actually going to be the only way that if we want to measure these skills, how we're going to be able to start to think about measuring them. Because the problem with them in STEM is it's really, really easy to look at the science because science tends to be very cut and dried. Is it right or is it wrong? Whereas these development of these skills are much more challenging. But I think, and this is where I know Rika agrees with me, we think this is so incredibly important. So if we're looking as educators for a framework, there are a number of ideas around theoretical models for STEM. So one of them came from very distinguished colleagues of ours. They called it the worldly perspective. And they were not so much involved in STEM education. They were very involved in integration at a time when integration was a very populistic terminology. That was in sort of the early 2000s. And what tends to happen is things rise and fall. So integration rose, there was big grants presented and given. And then when integration became the thing before, it's like a fashion, isn't it? Integration came out of fashion, STEM stepped up. Which I think was that it took its place. But they looked at this through their integration lens and saw that the way that they integrated, there was this local and global context around integrating the disciplines together. And there was a balance between local and global and between the integrated approaches and how the disciplines are separated. And there was an ability with different types of experiences as the teacher was in the classroom. They could map it in the model. What Rika and I felt, though, when we were looking at this was that we needed to put very explicitly the goals in there. And we came across another model, which was a STEM theoretical architecture model, which is a little bit complicated, but it actually looked at the same thing. It had the science, the technology, the engineering, and it looked at how we could find real world problems and think about the context of those problems. And there was this moving between the localized world of the classroom and the globalized world and what we might be doing with that. And I'll show you some examples of some of the things that we've been doing that sort of go out into that, definitely go out into that space. And we looked at ideas, methods, and values, and it was down in this values space that we started to see those skills coming back and being part of this model because we felt it needed to be measured. And I've kind of made them a bit bigger, but I've lost my box here. But anyway, so again, we're looking at how we're building the ideas, finding the problem, looking at the questioning, designing and building, exploring and challenging, and then what the methods look like and how that is building across the world right down into the values. Now, some of you who may have been in teaching for a while are looking at this notion of problem finding, generating ideas, thinking critically, and possibly are going, I've seen this before. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the best way to look at STEM is from the approaches that we're going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. In the meantime, we'll talk about the challenges in schools. So for schools, especially in high schools, we have to make STEM relevant. We have to find space in an overcrowded curriculum that tends to be very focused on their heads around all the science knowledge, let alone to start to look at how they can embed deep level maths and technology into some of these problems. And also in Indonesia, for example, and I know in Australia and also in Australia, there is no engineering stipulated into our curriculum. So we start to fall apart with this. And what we found in Australia, at least, was there was a decreasing number of students engaging not in just in STEM, but in science, the technology, the engineering, or the mathematics. And the numbers of in the pipeline coming through into tertiary was actually decreasing. So we've got problems. We've got sort of a framework, but what can that look like in a classroom? And all the pictures that you're seeing are some of the things that we have been doing. So we're going to look at two in the next few minutes. And Ella's going to tell me when I've run out of time because I have no idea what the time is. And she knows I can talk underwater with a mouthful of marbles for a long time, so she will have to stop me.
Yes, I will.
Okay. Thank you. if we go right back, so all these ideas coming through are new, but they're not. If we go back, we talk about the need for doing and the need for creating. And we're back to the work of people like John Dewey, who said that we want to be making and doing. And so the way that we've come through to look at STEM and to solve the STEM issue is twofold. We've looked at project-based learning, and that's the one we're going to talk about first very briefly, and problem-based. Now, they are very similar. You may not want to differentiate them, but for our purpose, it actually helped us to do that. So we'll look at the project-based learning before, and that is around the work that we've been doing with our makerspaces. So this is for projects, as Yuli and Ella alluded to at the beginning, where we worked with, in Australia, with our education and engineering students, and we had only girls to start with. And then when we came across to Indonesia, we're working with pre-service teachers, and India with pre-service teachers, who just happened in India, they were all young women. And we worked with developing workshop ideas that pre-service teachers were involved with, and then they modelled that in classrooms. So I hate to use the word train the trainer, but it kind of came out like that. So we talked about that notion of facilitation. And I know that the students at the ground in the primary schools found that a very different experience. So the notion of makerspace is another quite modern term. But for us, we've been looking at where the ideas of makerspace have come from, and we actually have found that the making idea comes back from Dewey and Papert, who were talking about this need to create, this need to make, this need to have ownership. And for the number of projects in gardens and in houses at the moment when we've all been in lockdown, I think it's very evident that people do like to tinker and to make things. So we've come out of this notion of this is based in good science, and then we can create maker spaces and give children permission in those spaces to be looking at how they can develop those skills. In fact, for teachers, especially teachers in schools where there is a high pressure to do well and a high level curriculum that's pushing all the time, maker spaces can be those places where teachers as well as students can try new ideas. They can fail because, to be honest, if we're going to build resilience for students, we have to teach them to fail and how they fail and fail well, which is just sounds terribly counterintuitive in a world where we are trying to protect children. Teaching them about failure and how to work through failure, I think, is so incredibly important. So that's where we're pushing our maker spaces. We've been working, I mean, it is great when those sorts of classes are mainstream, but it doesn't happen very, very often. So we've been using maker in Indonesia, in India. We are at the moment writing a book about maker spaces and as a way of being able to teach these 21st century learning skills. And it's been really interesting and lots of fun. So we've got some ideas about makers and maker spaces. What are maker spaces are not just free spaces. So continuum of maker space. There are traditional maker spaces, and there are maker spaces where we've been working, which are much more targeted in our approach. So we came to Indonesia, for example, with the Wigglebot, and I'll show you that Wigglebot, that was very specifically designed to teach the students, or to actually to see students' understanding of the concept of electricity. We didn't give them any of this detail. We gave them a Wigglebot, and we asked the students, the primary students, to think about how it might be put together. So we wanted them to be able to take it apart, look at the bits and pieces, think about what they already knew. So this was an applied level of knowledge, applying their understanding, which is quite a high level of Bloom's. And it was a very useful way for them to do this. So we found that, and we gave them just the materials at the beginning here, and they had to work it out. We did not tell them about where the battery needed. We did not tell them. We wanted them to work it out. And in fairness, most of the students do it really well. We have more trouble often with our primary educators who are reluctant when they don't know. The children are much more likely to have a go. And that I think is important because children do like to tinker and to play. And out where they put the legs on this. If they put the legs on too high, this one's got quite high legs. We can talk about stability. But when they turn it on, they know immediately about stability, the thing falls out. To do at that time and building resilience. So way of achieving STEM. And when I do this with my pre-service teachers, I get them to fill out something like this. They put the makerspace in the middle, the makerspace item in the middle, the artifact that they're making, and then they consider the science, the maths, and what else is included. They don't have to have, see it says here digital, not a set. I think that's really important that they can own that and be comfortable with. Looking at the century around the edge of that communication, decision making. It's about how we preserve this for those skills in our children, in the children classrooms. The perseverance one, for example, it's not necessary, it's not quite seen so strongly here, but in the catapults, incredibly frustrating, and we get a number of children that have no resilience at all, and once they can't do it once, will then give up and not want to keep trying, which is really quite interesting. So that again is really about the notion of developing resilience. We say to them at that point, and do we do them? We just step up to try and give them a hand without actually taking over, because teachers, we like children to be successful. We don't like to see them not succeed. The next one that is problem-based learning. So again, these are not new ideas, but given them a new twist. So the project-based learning, we twisted into a modern makerspace, very trendy, but again, it's that notion of making. The PBL, we gave this little bit of a twist. We've been using this model. I'm actually been teaching this to my pre-service teachers at the moment. We've been using this. This is the Hasner Platinum model that comes from Stanford Design. And we have been getting them to look at a social issue. So this is the website they used, which we designed. They used PBL, and they used the sustainability goals from UNESCO, and they have to solve a real problem in their local community. And that has been a real challenge. It's a very personal thing to do. Encouraging them to go through and look at, they have to find the problem. They have to then check it is a problem. Is it a problem for everybody else? How do we know? Who do we interview? With COVID has put up a load of problems that students have had to negotiate. So, for example, one of my students and I haven't checked out what it looks like, but her issue was that her gyms were closed. The gym was closed and she was struggling with this, and she didn't know how other people in her community who exercised at the gym were coping and what they were doing. So it's about empathizing and finding a problem, defining it, and ideating all the ideas that might be used to solve this problem. The ideation idea, the going wide with all kinds of ideas, is really important in this. And then we looked at prototyping a solution. In these cases with our students, we can't actually implement them. But if it's in a school setting, absolutely they can be implemented. So that is quite an important step into the testing phase. So this, as I said, is where my students have been working. And if you want to have a look, it's an open website. You're more than welcome. We've actually got student examples on there of activities that they've done using the model previously. I like this because it's open. It's encouraging some really good conversations around PBL. It's deep thinking and it's deep learning. And so if they want to find out something, they often have to go and do some research around it. So one of my favorite ones last year was about a student who he was an older student. He had children of his own and they were in primary school. And he was concerned because in his local area, a number of the children had not been immunised. So the issue was, well, why not? So he set off to do research and he had to find out about the diseases and the immunisation regime. He interviewed his local primary school. He did a lot of research online around this. So this was all the deep learning that he was doing as part of his experience. And what he determined was it wasn't actually that they were resistant to vaccination. They just didn't get round to it because the vaccination clinics in WA, where he lived, was only open every third Tuesday between 9 and 11, and you needed an appointment. And there were lots of migrant community living there whose English wasn't their first language, that to find the times and dates and remember to go do it was actually, and be able to get there, was actually problematic. So his solution that he proposed, and he wrote a letter to council, the local council, and that was his solution, was a pop-up clinic in the local supermarket. And he worked out how many people came to use the local shopping centre and how that would increase the rates. Now, this was a primary educator. He didn't have high levels of science, but he upskilled very quickly. It was a problem that he was interested in, and he owned it. And I think that's what we want them to be able to do in primary schools, to give students ownership of problems to solve. Because if we want them to be good problem solvers, if we give them those experiences now, then they're going to be better when it comes to these sorts of pandemics. They're going to know how to communicate, collaborate. They're going to be good problem solvers. And we need to be able to create them because, we're going to have more of these issues to solve. The last thing, if I've got a little bit of time, Ella, I thought I'd throw up some really useful digital tools that are helpful in classrooms if you are using online, if you're in an online space. So have we got time for that, Ella?
Yes.
Cool.
That's the question as well.
Okay. So a few digital tools. This one is Symbaloo. I don't know if you've seen this. It's a curation method.
Yes.
So it's about putting together ideas. So each of these squares links to a website. This is one of the ones that we use with our pre-service teachers. These belong to inquiry. So putting together inquiry ideas is fairly straightforward. The one on the left is for a Year 5 class and looks at the inquiry process. The one on the right is my pre-service teachers do it in first year. It also looks at the science inquiry process, and students get to investigate a problem online. It has to be a problem that so it's a little bit different from the PBL. It's a problem where the data is already existing. because we couldn't get 300 students going out in to look at, to collect data. It became really problematic. So those are ways that you can do inquiry very, very efficiently online. There is an awful lot of data out there that's being released all the time that students can have access to. So helping them to curate it and know what's good, and helping them to work their way through the inquiry process is really very useful. This is a really cool idea. I'm about to put this in action for some colleagues of mine who are fabulous STEM women. I'm going to make them into avatars. This is a tool that creates avatars, and you can you put people's voices with different people or animals, and they're able to do some presenting. And we use this as a way of defining, that students can use this as an interesting way to define an idea. So that's always really cool. And in primary school, students love it. They love putting their voices to a character. And when the character actually looks at you and moves its mouth and shakes its head back and forward. Oh, Ella, I'll make you into a character. You can choose what animal you want to be. I will put your voice to it, and then you can be an avatar.
Wow.
We use things like Trello as a communication tool. I like it because it's very visual, left to right. I don't know what sorts of things you guys do. I think there's been an influx of people using Teams and so forth for communication. Microsoft Teams apparently is very, very, very good, and it's getting better daily. But I kind of like something like this. We can communicate asynchronously rather than synchronously. So this notion of asynchronously, and I can leave questions for students that are emailed to them, and they can answer them on the page. And it's a shared community. So it enables you and your class to all participate. As you can see, there are 25 people on this particular Trello board at this point. So they were sharing videos and pictures when they were working in schools. So with some of the makerspace. And things like this, I think you've probably seen this, but this is Bubble Us. This is an ideation tool, a mind mapping tool. There's lots of different ones of those, and students really get it, and I really enjoy that. And this, again, would be another communication. This is a Padlet board. We're actually using Padlet boards at Curtin at the moment to review our units, which I think is very interesting. So we actually have them embedded into our Blackboard site, and every time a unit is completed, all the tutors can come on, and the Padlet board is set up a lot more linearly than this, and they can make comments under as a review, which is quite a good visual way of doing that. So I kind of like that. We've been using, you preempted me because I was going to show a picture of our international makers, STEMinists. We've been using even Facebook to communicate with our STEMinists, and we have a maker site at the moment. And I think that was almost what I wanted to say, apart from the fact that the STEMinist website has got a lot of really interesting information. And our latest area of study is around e-STEMinists, which is about environmental STEMinists and environmental education. So hopefully you can kindly fill out our survey. We've sent it to you. I know Ella did for me. It's an internationally validated survey for you sort of research people in the room. It came out of Taiwan, but it's a really useful way of looking at people's ideas, their knowledge, their behaviour, and their attitudes in an environmental space. So we've been looking at that, and as I said, I'm avataring colleagues in the environmental area to present that learning to students. So the only thing I was going to say internationally is we're still struggling with women in STEM. It's kind of the elephant in the room. It's quite severe in Australia at the moment, in the sense that we have them graduate, they just don't get very far. But in engineering, for example, this year, 6% of our first-year engineers are women. And that is just awful. It's dropped from the sort of 15-16%. It's now down at 7%. It doesn't seem to be getting any better. Women are incredibly underrepresented in this space, which is why I think the STEMinists started with a strong view for women. And we also happen to be women that thought that we should start it. So about soft skills, as I said, I don't like the word, but leadership, communication, collaboration. There's a whole range of soft skills that we are talking about needing for the future that we want all our graduates to have. And for tomorrow, the STEM of tomorrow, in Australia at least, by 2025, we have a strong STEM agenda still running. So the notion of ensuring that we get a STEM, that we get a well-balanced curriculum. Yuli, for inviting me.
Thank you, Rachel. It's very interesting. And then finding the new ideas.
Yeah, I like the website.
It has been so many resources that we can access rather than the first time we know about the STEM. And then, I don't know, Ella, probably you could have
Yeah.
Should I stop sharing?
No.
Oh, I've stopped.
Okay, there are some question here. Bapak Ibu ada yang mau bertanya langsung?
Okay, I will read the question in the Q&A because some of the participants probably if they cannot asking through the Q&A, probably they can asking through the chat as well. So the first question.
Ya, silakan Pak.
Bu Ella, Bu Yuli.
Yeah.
Can I?
Prof. So it is the head of the national curricula in Indonesia, Rachel.
Oh,
In the
Welcome,
education department. Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. In an invite in meeting this morning, then I think very important about your presentation.
challenge that we are facing across the world. First of all, we have to decide that this is important. I think we have to notice that the skills or decide that the skills are important. If we're saying that they are important, and Forbes magazine and a lot of the literature and companies are asking for those skills, the next question that we have is how do we work out how students are progressing along that continuum? And to be honest, we haven't done it in Australia particularly well. It's something that Rika and I feel is very important, but it's difficult. So I think what our feeling is if we are creating maker spaces, for example, they are small areas where teachers can practice looking for the continuum of those skills and how those skills are starting to develop. So I think they can end up as playgrounds, not just for children to do things. They can end up as pedagogical playgrounds for teachers to practice. Because if we're asking them to do something new, and we'd be asking them to look at these skills and strategies, then we need to give them somewhere to practice, to determine how children are actually managing to progress along those skill continuums. And the one thing that Australia does have that is very, very underutilized, I have to say, is it does have the general capabilities broken into subcategories and mapped on a continuum. And it's mapped on a continuum, and it's outside of the science, the maths, the technology, the engineering, the history or whatever, in the general capabilities, and they don't get used very often. But the vision for that, I think, was was fabulous when it was envisaged. And I think the time now is coming for us to say we need to recognize these skills and we need to help children develop the skills. And we need to work out how we would measure them, how we would map them, and we need help to do that. So I think that's where we are in the scheme of things. And I'm not telling teachers what to do, nor do I want to make them feel stressed that they don't do it. I'm saying it's something that I'm working on in my space and with Rika as researchers to try and come up with a way that this is feasible to do. So I think it's a fabulous question. I think you went right to the absolute key point of this, Professor, and I think it was a really great question. So thank you so much for asking it.
Yeah. So Rachel.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Rachel, and see you.
Thank you, Prof. Awal. So.
Thank you, Bu Yuli. Yeah. Thank you, Bu Ella. Terima kasih banyak semuanya. Yeah, terima kasih. Thank you very much.
So I would like.
Let me, Ibu Yuli, let me have my own question.
Yes.
Yes, please.
I'm looking. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ibu Ella, Ibu Yuli, for this opportunity. Very happy to be with you all here. Hi, Rachel. Happy to see you here, Rachel. Let me introduce, first of all, my name is Luki. I'm actually a high school teacher in Subang, West Java. And I recognized them about 2 or 3 years ago. And then after that, I was just introduced, only recognized without knowing nothing. But then at the beginning of this year, I was invited 2 or 3 times by the committee of STEM in seminars. Let you know that I'm language teacher. I'm not science. So let me know from you, Rachel, how STEM brought or used in language class. So since I actually loved what your statement also at the beginning of this meeting, you mentioned collaboration, cooperation. I love it. And sometimes this is not collaboration and communications. What I did in my class and my community, I also do like networking, because sometimes like this, what we do this morning, and I love that one. I try to be bland. Many things comes to my mind when I also know STEM, because since I am language teacher, not science teacher, but I try to do this and have this STEM in my class with students. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Are you primary teachers?
No, secondary.
Oh, secondary
teacher.
Oh yeah, secondary. Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean, it is one of the challenges, and it would be remiss of me to say that this was easy. For your language class, I couldn't teach a language. I'm completely dud at languages, so I know that you are the expert in that space. But for me, it would be bringing science as a context. So, for example, the language that you would teach, you could teach it around the context of something related to a science idea. So, for example, if you were, and I don't know why I think of this, but bees are important, buzzy, honeybees. You could build with your students a bee hotel or a bee house for bees. It's a simple task, but you then would shape the language that's being used. You might shape how they are developing their understanding. You could use then the context to create the language that underpins it and that's your area of expertise. So that would be how I would approach it. I could use my science, my STEM stuff as a way of being able to do the language. So I'm not sure if
Rachel,
that
let
helps
me
you.
interrupt. I'm very sorry for interrupting, but I was faced by the administrations of designing the curriculum when the form asked me to do something there, because I have no mathematical process in. I don't really common with the physical or the science one there. That is the problem of making, writing, or designing the form, the administration one, which is very complicated.
Yes, the only thing I can suggest that might be helpful for you would be to work out how you could collaborate with your peers, your colleagues. And when I worked in the area of integration, there was a very strong collaboration required to get integrated projects deeply off the ground. So I reviewed a project in an Islamic school in Perth where the teachers actually came together. The science teacher worked alongside the language teacher, working alongside the technology teacher. And that was how they were able to create this beautiful, and it was a beautiful project, but it was a lot of negotiation across the curriculum areas. But the science teacher was involved in an aspect of this project, and the mathematics teacher, and they worked together to build it. So it depends on how it depends on the energy of the educators that you work with and how you are going to sort of negotiate that, and your curriculum too, obviously. And so I can only make suggestions. I was a teacher in high school for years. I know the realities are often somewhat difficult. I think that any kind of small way that we can do some of these ideas it is a start. And sometimes it just takes a start to get the ideas going.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Ibu Ella, Ibu Yuli.
So Rachel, I will read through the question first in the Q&A and the chat room.
So many questions for you.
And then we know the question is indicators of thinking.
Oh, good. Thinking is good. Thinking is good. No, absolutely. Oh no, I'd much rather there was lots of questions. I think STEM is best for a vocational school. I found one question. Do you?
No. Have a look the Q&A. Can you have a look the Q&A? So there is a two side, the chat room and the Q&A first.
I'm in the Zoom webinar chat.
Yeah.
Then the
Can you see the Q&A?
Q&A. There is chat and Q&A.
Okay, let's have a look at the Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It says there are no open questions in my Q&A.
Yeah, in answer. Let's pretend you have answered all of the questions.
Oh, have I? I'm very good.
already answered.
I just click it all.
Oh, well done. I think I agree. Suggested that STEM is very, very suitable for elementary school students.
Yeah.
Is it suitable for high school students or university students?
Yeah,
I actually think that when we started this conversation at the beginning and we talked about COVID, I think it is there that you get the connectedness between people, and they bring high levels of expertise. And I don't think one person is going to be able to do STEM across all those spaces in a tertiary space. But I think it's very important that there is a collaboration and a communication and working together. So whether it is compounds that are being created at Curtin that are being sent over to be tested in Thailand, or whatever is going on, I think it is actually much more authentic in science buildings and in engineering buildings in tertiary spaces. That I think that is very much what happens.
Okay.
Does it mean that there's S, there's T, there's E, there's M every day? No. I said to you, if you are looking for an equal amount at all times, I think you are. I think that becomes contrived. I think you want it to be authentic.
Okay, next question. How to join with STEM organization? Is it available for undergraduate students?
I mean, everyone's welcome to become STEMinists. We love that. We love the notion of building. We didn't set out to build build an organization. What we encourage people to do is, in Australia, for example, there is a lot of communications and teams that come together teachers come together around conversations. So Facebook, for example, has in Australia a STEM community. I got invited to join a STEAM community in India for teachers. I think those sorts of spaces where real teachers talk to each other, I think are actually very powerful places for really good conversations. I don't stand in a space to be all-knowing. And so therefore wanting answers, I think, is it's not going to happen. What is better is this notion of, I've tried this worked. Have you tried that? That might work. Let's negotiate. What worked for you might work for someone else. And this sharing of ideas is much more organic. And when it works like that, it can be very, very powerful for teachers. And I really wish when I started in my 20s that I'd had the internet and the capacity to work with colleagues remotely in Java or in Indonesia or wherever, whereas I was contained by the people in my school. And when I started in education, in science education in high school, it was mostly men. And I was a young woman, and that was a very difficult space to say, I don't know, I can't do this, can someone help me? So I think there's a lot more opportunities now, and I'd go with I'd reach out to colleagues and I'd share, this worked for me. And that's what we're writing at the moment in our Makerspace book, is things that worked for us. All our knowledge of all the years of what worked and what didn't, and what was, a disaster. Is always good because you learn from your best disasters. So I hope that helps. You're still welcome to join the STEMinist community. The STEMinist website is free. We're about to post some things about the environment that we'd love you to be part of. It's always changing and developing as I get excited and want to change and develop things.
Yeah.
So and I'll definitely see if I can put this talk up so that it can be there as well, if we can do that. So that would be nice.
Yep.
So the next question.
Directly, maybe?
No, I mean it's already 11 question first. Probably
11 until tomorrow.
Question has been answered. I mean, for elementary schools, it can be high school, even a university student, Pak Sigit. And then the next question, Andari, how to make sure our students have good quality science when they must learn at home is COVID-19.
Oh, dearie me.
They have
Yes.
the science process skill. And
I think that's a really difficult question about how they learn at home. When I was asked by my university to talk to my science trainee teachers about going out into about teaching online, I didn't talk about teaching online. I talked about emergency management, because for Australia, once you leave Perth, we have an incredibly poor internet outside of Perth area. So if you go outside of the Perth metropolitan area into our regional areas, you are going to not be able to use the internet. So therefore, you're back with paper and pencil. If you're in a low socioeconomic school and children at home don't have computers, you're back with pencil and paper. So I think the best thing you can offer with children at this time, and it's only going to be for a short time, and I'm sure they'll be back at school and a program, I would let them tinker. I'd let them go out. I'd let them build a bee hotel and research what that might look like to increase the number of bees into your garden. Or I'd let them cook. And when you cook, there's so much chemistry embedded into that.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
That would be where I would go, and I would hesitate to make children miserable at a time when they're already quite anxious, because there's a lot of things that we don't know, and there's a lot of things that we don't know as adults, and that it's been a very anxious time for everybody. So that would be my advice at this point, and they will go back to school. But I think at the other times, it's much better to just enjoy what it is they can do. Would you agree, Bayuli?
Yes, because actually the minister already gives the what we call it, like the instruction to do the project and then to do the authentic learning. So the basic skill, the life skills, cooking and so on is also related to the science, to the STEM, and the other things that I agree that you stated about the anxious, the emotion, the stressful, especially even the teachers itself. Can you imagine have to achieve the curricula at the same time, and then the condition just have to be stay at home? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been a different world, but I think the notion of the problem solving. So especially high school students, I'd be talking to them about the positive stuff that's come out of COVID, which is what I talked about. I think that's quite powerful. You know, that the nation, that every nation of the world is working together and sharing their knowledge and open sourcing. And there's a whole load of open source data and information that's being produced that I think is just so heartening as a science person to see. And I think that's what we have to show them, because these sorts of issues are not country specific. This COVID-19 didn't go, well, you're Australian, we're not going to infect you. It said, right, we're taking out people generally. And that's the deal. So, I think you're right. I've got a question here. I'm going to answer that belongs to Benny. I think it's Benny. My response is, this is one of the most difficult questions about the E in engineering. And the way the US dealt with this was really clever. They incorporated engineering into their science curriculum in schools. So they were very smart from the get-go. But for the rest of us, it poses a huge issue around, and it depends on how you're tweaking what you think engineering is. So if you're looking at engineering as a process, and if we go back to the conversation about what engineers do that I borrowed Nicoletta's slides and talked about those, then I think it is very much part of that inquiry process. And that notion, Nicoletta was talking about, and she's a professor in engineering, was talking about problem solving as being a significant part of engineering. So I would go with that, and I wouldn't get overly concerned about it having to have this and that and everything in there. I think that was one of the things I really wanted to say. Someone said, can you teach STEM with a language? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you need language to be able to explain it. A language is core to our beings. And so literacy is absolutely imperative in this. So I think it's about communication. Someone's asked me about STEAM, as in with the A. I'm getting older. Yeah, you're going to ask me why I'm going to say this. I see the aesthetics as being important. I'm starting to see situations where the artistic side of things is really valuable, as is the promotional side of things that you are sharing and how you share that. So my latest project is around creating very large STEM models of sharks. And I will share them with you guys, some pictures with you guys. But they are huge models, and they have got all these rubbish attached to them, and they're raising awareness about the environment. So there I've got the A very deeply embedded in there, and it's been a great conversation starter. So, we've got a coffee pod turtle. that that we've made. So all those things will be displayed.
So they should not be. Wait. Okay, good. So
Sorry,
you miss.
did I miss a question?
Yeah. Where is it? Oh my goodness, it's not Benny.
There's a question about increasing the number of women in STEM in the workforce. Oh gosh, this is Monita Olivia. This is one of the most difficult questions, and there's millions of dollars. So if you come up with a quick answer, just let me know, and we'll make millions together. It's a very difficult topic. I think engineering, for example, in Australia has real gender issues. It's a very misogynistic place to be. Women don't like it, so they don't tend to be in there, which is a shame. I went away with 100 phenomenal STEM women. They were just amazing. And you as women would know the sorts of things they face. They face the notion of juggling all those career aspects of it, and the guilt that comes with that. And all those sorts of things as we predominantly do all the child caring and rearing. I don't have any suggestions. As I said, if I did, I'd probably go for a grant to do that. The way that we do it with our pre-service teachers and our primary pre-service teachers, we started the STEMinists to increase their confidence and competence in science and technology and engineering and mathematics. And for Rika and I think we can look out into the communities of networks that we have and see that has been successful, that teachers have stepped into STEMinist spaces that they didn't expect to step into. And we never really went back and did a sort of a longitudinal study, but that I think has been a real bonus of that. They felt better. They started to feel like that. We took them to conferences. They addressed academics, and all of a sudden they started to feel much more confident and competent. So I think projects like that are really helpful, but I don't know if there's a way that you could bring something like that. I mean, we still fight for funding for our STEMinists. So, and when we don't get funding, it's very, very difficult to do anything. So not sure how to fix that. As I said, if you come up with a really good plan, let me know. Anything else?
The Ella Badria asking question about how to teach STEM education to our student. Her student is the early childhood, the kindergarten student, and use the loose part material while we teach STEM education.
They do a fabulous job in early childhood through play. I think they are some of the best places where children tinker and play and enjoy. And I think what we do as they get older is we make them much more serious, and we focus them on sitting and concentrating and telling us what we've just told them. And I think early childhood is one of the best places to let kids experience that amazing wonder of and have questions that they want answered. And I think that's what STEM is about, this notion of problem-based or project-based. It's about, I've got this question, how am I going to solve it? And I think that sort of stuff is fabulous in early childhood.
Yeah, good. And then the next one is, does the STEM concept is included in the curricula of teacher training in Australia?
Yes. Yes, we have students can do a STEM set of units that will give them a STEM specialization at Curtin. So yes, we have a series of units, and the makerspace is one, and the problem-based one is a second unit that we run. Wow. So we get students to do, and then we get them to show us how they could embed those programs into their teaching. So we do that, and I think that actually helps them be much more thoughtful practitioners. But then I like STEM, so here I am.
So Rachel, so for the teaching for teaching the student teachers,
Yeah.
do the lectures have to be like you give the engineering lecture, come to the class, or no? Just
No. I do it through the notion of problem-based learning. So I give them the notion, and then they need to work out what do they need to know to solve the problem that they want to find out about. In the maker space, we give them projects and they run them in schools, and then they take apart the project and work out what they were teaching. Was there science? Was there math? Was there engineering involved in this? In the same way that we did when we came out and worked with you guys, but in a bit more detail. So pipeline, we run it with them as a workshop, we take it and run it in the school with children, and then we come back to the class and we go, well, what questions did you ask, and what answers did the students give you, and how could you think about reframing the question to look for the students' ability to problem solve, or, you know, what was the science embedded in here, and how much science can we teach them, and what could you to do? It's a very about them doing rather than us telling, because I really don't think that's the most effective way of educating.
Really. So the next question is, if STEM learning can be integrated in other social science, and how is STEM learning different from project, probably the social science itself, and then how STEM learning different from project-based learning? How to differentiate between STEM and project?
Well, I think I use problem-based learning. I'm starting with that one. I use problem-based learning as a way to deal with this STEM conundrum. And I definitely agree. When I do an inquiry, for example, with my first years using the website that I was showing you, and it could be Wider Wales Beach themselves, that's an inquiry question that covers sustainability, and that has a whole load of science, but that has geography in there. That has do Wales Beach themselves more frequently in culture, across beaches where the sand is very steep or the sand is very shallow, or on the north or south side, or when the water temperature. So it's a whole load of questions that come up that are not bounded by the S, the T, the E, the M. And therefore the solution and that's what I said, they have to be authentic. Yeah. If you're not dealing with authentic, if you're going, oh, where's the engineering in there, you're not going to end up with a problem based. Yeah. You're going to end up with something that's contrived. Yeah. So I think, no, absolutely. I think this is STEM is sort of a hidden agenda for integration still. And I think integration, you solve a problem of COVID, you don't stop and say, I can't solve it because I don't have this person. You ring the engineer, or you ring the scientist, or you ring whoever, you speak to whoever you need to bring together the ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The next question.
It's really about the creativity of the teachers.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. This is, and that's, I think, why I like it. Because I can get to be really creative about how I set these things up, and they can be creative, and I get a very deep sense of satisfaction when they come with what they've decided to do. That student that decided to do vaccination, I find that stuff really interesting. It was all his idea, and I was overjoyed that he took this down and got quite deeply into the knowledge of the science. And he was a primary educator. He didn't need that level of science knowledge, but he enjoyed himself and engaged really deeply. And that for me was what it's about. Yeah, right. That for me is what it's about, to be an educator. Mm-hmm. So I think that's significant and important. Oh. And that he can do that with his class of students when he's on prac. And I think that's where he is at the moment. So any more questions?
Yeah, many.
So many.
How probably I tried from the bottom because
yeah. The Kasmudin one. The Kasmudin.
Yeah. Pak Kasmudin,
Kasmudin.
what are the weakness of implementing STEM in the learning process and within the different level of compliance on until high school and even the university? What is the weakness?
The weakness, I think, is the sense that you are only thinking about science, technology, engineering, and maths. And as we've just talked about, all other areas can be incorporated and embedded into that space. I think that's a weakness when we think about only them. I think the other weakness is around, and I'm not sure this is a weakness, but it depends on how focused you are and what your assessment is asking, because the assessment drives the curriculum. So if you've got an